Joining me is Paul Chappell. He's a West Point graduate and Iraq War veteran, Peace Leadership Director at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, and also the author of 3 books on waging peace. Paul, really great to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me, David. I really appreciate it.
The first thing I want to talk about is you've written and talked about being kind of the target of your own father's post-combat rage and paranoia, as you've described it. But nevertheless, you pursued your own military career. You graduated from West Point in 2002. You served in Iraq as an Army captain in '06. For many people who have your experience growing up, maybe going into the military wouldn't have been their first choice. How did you kind of end up that way?
I think there are a couple reasons. One major reason was I grew up believing that war makes us safe. If you listen to any president over the past 30 years, they talk about how war protects freedom and democracy. And more recently, they talk about how war fights terrorism and protects our security as a nation and liberates people. So we're taught that war is peace. And when I grew up watching action movies or reading comic books, the hero would beat up the bad guy, save the world. And so I believed that you need war to end war, you need violence to stop violence. Another reason was my father. He was born in 1925. He was half white and half black. And he grew up under segregation. And he told me that when I was young, he told me the only place in America where a black man has a fair chance is in the Army. And that was the reality of how he grew up, where the Army had to be segregated prior to civil rights. And in the 50s and prior to that, black men didn't have much of a chance outside of the military. So
you end up in Iraq, and at a certain point you start to doubt that that particular war is really going to bring peace. Talk a little bit about the timing. In other words, did you start to have doubts about the effectiveness of war as a means to eventual peace before you served in Iraq, during, after?
Yeah, before I had realized I had gained a lot of insights about war, how war isn't inevitable. I had learned a lot from military history about how human beings aren't naturally violent. But it took me a while to figure out what is the alternative to war, because I saw war as just a necessary evil, a bad last resort. And I began to realize how nonviolent techniques, which Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and many others practice, is actually more effective than war in terms of providing security for our country and potentially the world.
Let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, I want to actually, before we get to that, let me follow up a little bit about your time in Iraq. Did you find yourself being affected in your day-to-day by your doubts about the broader mission that was being served or not served by being there?
Yes, I didn't think that we should have gone, but at that time, and that was 5 years ago, my mind has changed a lot. I was of the mindset that, well, if we break it, we have to fix it, and we can't just leave. Once we've caused that chaos, we have some sort of moral obligation to at least leave the country in some sort of stable situation. But when I was there, I began to see I began to see different things that made me question that. So,
when you would have candid discussions with your colleagues in Iraq, or maybe the question is, were there candid discussions where questions about the mission and the prospects of bringing peace through this occupation, was that ever discussed? Was it okay to discuss that? Was it okay only in certain circles? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was. When I was there, I found a lot of people in the military who were open to discussion, and which also furthered my own way of thinking. But I think Iraq is a symptom of a deeper problem. I think that if you just look at the evidence from American foreign policy, how the American government supports dictatorships around the world, you see that even the Iraq War is a symptom of a much deeper problem that our country is facing.
Do you get the sense that, or maybe you've gotten this directly, that sometimes people hear you speak and they say, Paul Chappell is clearly just a pacifist and he is against war on kind of a theoretical level, and he's not really connected with the realities that sometimes war is necessary. So I guess my question to you is, are you against war, period, or are you against war specifically because of how the United States and other countries have waged it? Go into that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that in the past, there were some necessary wars in the past. And that's why the war propaganda is so hard to refute, because there have been a couple wars in the past, this minority that were necessary. It's hard to argue from the perspective of the Greeks that they shouldn't have fought against the Persians when they were being invaded. It's hard to argue from the perspective of the British that they shouldn't have defended themselves against the Nazis. And Gandhi said, if you have to choose between violence and doing nothing, you should not hesitate to use violence. And Gandhi supported Poland's violent resistance against Nazi Germany. So there are a couple of occasions in history where there have been wars where if you were being attacked, you have to defend yourself. And that, again, is why the war propaganda is so persuasive, because they can make every modern war seem like World War II, or they can make every modern war seem like the Civil War or a fight for freedom. But I don't have as much a moral obligation against war, nor did Gandhi, tying it into how he influenced me. But I found that nonviolent techniques in this era, in the 21st century, are just more effective. In terms of a way of combating these problems, nonviolence is just a more effective method, or as Gandhi would call it, a more powerful weapon than violence.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because you've said that you've seen compelling evidence that this idea that human beings are naturally violent or eventually get to a point where violence is just what happens in some kind of instinctual sense. There's a lot of writing that suggests that that is the case. In other words, that whether you look at when people start hypothesizing about space exploration, one of the first discussions is, listen, we know human nature will eventually lead to space wars over who owns what in space, or what have you. Talk a little bit about the evidence that you look at that suggests the opposite.
Yeah, I look at a lot of evidence, and I write about a lot of the evidence, and it's really overwhelming in terms of if you just look at military history. But if I could just offer one quick piece of evidence, if I could offer one quick piece, war is one of the most traumatizing things a human being can go through. War drives people insane. And even advocates of war say that war is hell. But if human beings are naturally violent, why would war be so traumatizing? If we were naturally violent, why would war drive people insane? And if we were naturally violent, why wouldn't people go to war and come back more mentally healthy? Why wouldn't people just go to war and come back more mentally healthy? And if there was a draft, why wouldn't everyone want to volunteer? And that's one reason why there is no draft now, is because it separates the American population from war. Because if there was a draft, you'd have much more American opposition to what's going on now.
Present, kind of in the last bit of time we have here, present an idea for a more effective, broader way of waging peace, as you've written about, right? I mean, is it about addressing other issues? Maybe is it poverty? Is it resource allocation? The fact that so much food is wasted while at the same time so many people don't have food? Where would you focus?
I'd focus primarily, the root problem is how human beings think. If you look at every problem, racism, segregation, oppression of women, war, genocide, all those problems come from how people think, and all the progress comes from changing how people think. So if any American politician today were running for president and said that we should bring back slavery, bring back segregation, women shouldn't be able to vote or own property, people would look at him like he's insane. But 200 years ago, that's how virtually every American politician spoke, and that's how most Americans thought. And I'm half Korean, a quarter white, and a quarter black, and I grew up in Alabama. And the fact that I'm not a slave today is because people change how other people thought. And the same process can be used for war and other problems, especially if we understand the deeper underlying causes of those problems and how we can change our own behavior and the behavior of others through transforming how they think. And you're not going to convince everybody. Every single man in America wasn't convinced that women should have the right to vote. There's still men in America who don't think women should have the right to vote. But you transform enough attitudes where it becomes a law, and then you have the police to enforce that law.
All right, we've been speaking with Paul Chappell. He's a West Point graduate, Iraq War veteran, also Peace Leadership Director at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. Paul, really a pleasure to have you on, and I'd love to have you back in the future.
Oh, thank you. And we have a website, wagingpeace.org, and I have a website, peaceforrevolution.com, if people would find out more about our training for nonviolence. So thank you for having me.
Okay, thanks so much. Let's take a break, and we'll be back with plenty more after this.